so important, you should say it too.
Yeah. So important I should say it twice. Okay. Thank you guys for being patient. So much of the value of this is that we record it, and so that, we have it for the future. And we'll try again. Take two. So, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another amazing session of Surah Al-Hujurat for tonight, for Saturday. And inshallah, it's going to be an amazing session. I just wanted to call people's attention to the incredible khutbah that the Sheikh gave yesterday, where one of the most important findings that we really zeroed in on is this report that CARE just released, where they had done a study of expenditures or investments into organizations that could be classified as Islamophobic between the years 2017 and 2019. And they discovered that over $105 million has been invested into these organizations through charitable giving. So some things like Fidelity, Schwab, donor-advised funds, and also some, obviously, Christian evangelist organizations, as well as Zionist organizations, people who are largely, Christian and Jews who are very committed to the causes that they believe in. And they, it was a really important mind twister when, Sheikh pointed out, listen, we oftentimes criticize people who have money as spending their money on luxury items and cars and vacations and things like that. But if you think about the size of that number, $105 million, people were so convinced and felt such conviction that Islamophobia or Islam and Muslims are such a threat that they were willing to invest $105+ million into the threat of Islam and Muslims. And that is a really impressive number, because that is money that they didn't spend on luxury items and things that, for their children or investments and all of that. They spent it because they're worried about Muslims and Islam. And, like when I think about how apathetic Muslims are in our community, it's really amazing. Like, I wonder if we are actually even worth that amount of investment. But regardless, that is the investment that they've made. And when I think about how hard-pressed we are here to try and raise money to support the Tafsir project or the Surah project, we really can't even get to the point of raising 0.5%, which is what we would need. So, what it just makes you wonder, when I think about what Sheikh has said oftentimes about this being, the jihad of our times really being the jihad of the intellect, the jihad of the ideas, and communication. When we think about Muslims and how we talk about ourselves and how we, defend ourselves, defend our faith, defend our prophet, oftentimes I found that people don't have the substance. Like when they talk about Islam, it used to be, Islam is a religion of peace. And when people come forward and they attack the prophet and they say things like he's a pedophile, he had so many wives, Aisha was, a child, we oftentimes are beset with doubt because we don't have the, the education or the knowledge or, a response that is truly substantive and that can turn things around. So where does that kind of thing come from? Or even when people accuse the Quran of being a book of violence. I think about what we are doing here at Project Illumine and creating, this knowledge. We're learning the language. We're learning the substance. This knowledge is actually what you can take and carve into a message to turn around and fight back and be on the offensive and actually return the gaze. And so I ask myself, how much is that worth? I mean, truly, if someone comes and makes an accusation and you have nothing to answer with, that is so painful and destructive. But imagine if you had in your back pocket, oh, sure, that's because XYZ, and you come away with a really compelling argument, and we educate our Muslim youth to be able to communicate in that way with very substantive knowledge. How much is that worth? And that is truly what we're creating here. So it's truly a shame that, we have not been able, as a community, to create that kind of conviction that, that we see happening in other faith communities where they, would donate towards knowledge. And, there are a lot of reasons for that. And so again, I would highly recommend, if you haven't watched the khutbah yesterday, to do that, because it was extremely valuable in understanding the Muslim mindset and what it's going to take for us to turn it around. And, with that, it is also very sad. We are starting this week with, UCLA Law School. So we have a really intense semester before us. Sheikh is teaching two classes, and also is on a committee where he, it's an internal appointments committee where they have to evaluate the promotion for 3 people. And he just found out that there is another element that is going to be extremely time-consuming and stressful. So this, from Project Illumine's perspective, will definitely cut into the number of halakas that we're going to be able to give during this semester. And we're just going to have to play it week by week and see how we're doing, because we don't want to burn out Sheikh. And it's sad because there are other people that can play this role other than Sheikh. There are other people who can teach these classes. There are other people who can serve on appointments committees and determine whether someone, is deserving of a promotion. But there are not many people, if any, who can do this project for the Quran, for this knowledge. And how valuable is this, and how important is it? And if we really had our act together, we would take Sheikh and just have him do nothing else but focus on this knowledge that we need as Muslims, the knowledge of the Quran, the knowledge of the Surah, the way, that substance and content that can make a difference in our world, and that can allow Muslims to be competitive and proud and articulate and incisive and, on the offense, not just on the defense or silent and apathetic. So if you guys, I'm trying to think about creative ways to, move forward with phase 2 of Project Illumine, which I've talked about, which is the Surah. But if you have the opportunity to share with people, how valuable is this knowledge? How important would it be if we had this? And maybe that might spark interest. Maybe we could do something to raise that 0.5% of the 105 million that Jews and Christians are able to raise and spend directly against us. So with that, I'm so excited to delve into another surah, inshallah, another incredible opportunity to learn the Quran, access this substantive knowledge. And inshallah, if we finish our project and publish this as a tafsir, at least we will have this to work with to create that content that we can use to fight back. So thank you for joining us, and inshallah, we look forward to a wonderful session, inshallah.
They raised this money over what period?
2 years, 2017 to 2019. So, we have not been able to raise 0.5% of that in, the 4+ years that we've been in existence as Suli. So, but alhamdulillah, this is like, for the people who really follow what we do and really believe, there are people who, have been tireless in giving, and we're so grateful for that. I just wish that more people were aware of this access to this knowledge, which has the potential to be just so empowering for so many Muslims. Inshallah.
I just want the people who, because I know that these recordings, I've come to learn that people pick them up in different countries, and even Muslim countries. I get messages from the most unexpected of places, of people that eventually this tafsir gets to them. And from the perspective of someone who carries the Quran and carries the Seerah in their intellect, in their heart, in their soul, and that Allah, from the very beginning, told us the proof of piety is action. The proof of piety is not posturing, it's not performance, it's not emotional displays. Proof of piety is sacrifice and hard work. And then you exist in a historical moment where the people who hate you and hate your religion are willing to sacrifice from the money that they earn, from the profits that could go to buying yachts and airplanes and cruises and whatever else rich people spend on. No, they're not going to spend on this. They're going to spend on fighting you and your religion. And over 2 years, they raise $105 million to pay the salaries of people who've dedicated their lives to do nothing but attack Muslims. Full-time people. They have no other career other than earning a salary to demonize and attack Islam and Muslims. And then on the other hand, you find Muslims still think the proof of piety is what you wear, how you drink water, whether you use obscene language or not. In other words, performances, but not sacrifice. In other words, displays of piety. What I've called in my writings pietistic affectations. Because they are. They're really pietistic affectations. It's not the sunnah of the Prophet. The sunnah of the Prophet is to sacrifice everything for your faith. That's the sunnah of the Prophet. The sunnah of the Prophet was not about growing a beard, was not about hijab, was not about how you sit or how you drink water or where you put your hands in prayer. That was not, these were all secondary issues, even if that. But the main issue was what type of investment you're making in your faith. And so your enemies invest this much in targeting you, and what are you investing to defend your faith? Leave alone developing your defense strategy into an offensive strategy. Leave alone that. I mean, we're not even thinking of that. But can you imagine you carry the Quran in your heart and in your soul, and you carry the Seerah in your heart and your soul, and you live in a historical moment where your counterpart, the Islamophobic counterpart of you, someone who carries the Quran and Seerah in their mind and intellect to demonize and to trash them. So your counterpart is supported to an absurd extent. I mean, it is like as if, can you imagine if at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the kuffar were willing to spend not 10 times what Muslims spend, not 100 times what Muslims spend, not 1,000 times what Muslims spend, but tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands times what Muslims spend. Can you imagine what the fate of Islam would have been? It is mind-numbing. It is mind-numbing. And we sit and say they're materialistic. No, we are materialistic. We say, oh, they're hedonistic. They don't have a purpose in life. No, we are hedonistic. Every fault is actually within us. It's not them. Because they actually are committed to their cause, even if it's an unjust cause. So, Christian evangelists who give up this amount of wealth just because they believe they want to bring Christ to Muslims. And Jewish Zionists who are willing to give up everything to see Israel dominant and supreme. So the entire region can go to hell as far as they're concerned. The entire region can be overrun by dictatorship, corruption, bloodshed, as long as Israel is safe and happy and prosperous. And they are willing to spend any amount of money to make sure that happens. It's astounding. It's mind-boggling. I have my first class in my Muslims Race and Law course this coming week. And I was hoping that I would get 2 or 3 students for the class, to be quite honest. I was really hoping it would be but to my shock, there's about over 30 students that signed up for the class. And to be quite honest, I'm embarrassed. I mean, I looked at the roster of students, and most of them are not Muslim. And I have to intellectualize what is at an existential level a highly embarrassing situation. How do you intellectualize the incomprehensible? Because it is, I am sure, I've taught this course before, and non-Muslim students, naively and innocently ask the most biting and hurtful questions. Well, if this is happening, because we talk about disappearances, we talk about black sites, we talk about the war on terror and its effect on Muslims, we talk about how Muslims are, basically the human rights and humanitarian exception to the universe, because no one seems to care if you don't apply the paradigm of human rights to Muslims, etc., etc. And the students basically, they're well, how come we never hear Muslim voices? How come Muslims seem to be largely so apathetic? Well, how come there is no narrative of Muslims rising to meet the challenge? And you give them intellectualized responses that you yourself are not convinced of. But that's the academic game, right? You just have to La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. I don't know. It's mind-numbing. It's astounding. How can Allah have entrusted us with something so astoundingly beautiful, and we are so astoundingly oblivious? I don't know. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa subhanallah al-Ali al-Azim. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. سورة الحجرات. A short surah, but as you will see, it has a very poignant and a very unforgettable message. So first, let's situate the surah. Surah Al-Hujurat is from definitely the late Medina period, and in all likelihood, it is revealed in the 8th or the 9th century of Hijrah, so quite late. And there is even some indications from within the tradition that it might have even been revealed after the conquering of Mecca. Although, so quite a late revelation, and a revelation at a time where, so, we know in retrospect that in a year or two, the Prophet ﷺ will die. And when you encounter a revelation that is quite late, and you try to understand the context of this revelation, of course, that begs the question, logically, why does this revelation come so late in the process? And add to this, there are, as we will talk about, there are within Surah Al-Hujurat itself references to events that took place in Medina where part of these references are to an ongoing dynamic that we know about from the beginning of the Medina period that persisted. And the ongoing dynamic is the existence of a dissenting group, a group that the Quran refers to as the hypocrites, but that this group continues to create quite a bit of headache for this nascent, still very young Muslim Ummah. And the way that the Quran talks about the dissenting group this late in the game is, as we will see, is quite significant. Because you can imagine that, well, if, by now Muslims have fought and won a number of battles, possibly by now Muslims have conquered even Mecca, and we know that, again, from a rational point of view, if you are a policy analyst, you'd say, well, the existence of a dissenting group once the Prophet dies is going to be a bigger problem. And if the dissent is somewhat muted at the time of the Prophet, well, that dissent will explode out in the open once the Prophet dies. And so that begs the question then, how did Allah choose to deal with this dissenting group, although Allah knows that in short order Allah will take the Prophet's soul away? Because in that is instructional to us. That is educational to us. Nothing in the Quran is happenstance or haphazard. Everything is there to communicate to us something, to teach us something. Now, moreover, as we will see, at this time, late in the game, late in this Medina period, there are groups that are converting to Islam, entire tribes or clans that are converting to Islam, but definitely have not had the benefit of 10 years of persecution in Mecca, have not had the benefit of going through a hijrah where they sacrificed everything, have not had the benefit of being the Ansar where they sacrificed a great deal to accommodate and assimilate the Muhajirun. So they're late converts and their anchor in Islamic ethics is quite weak. And Surah Al-Hujurat shows evidence that the influx of these groups, as we will detail and talk about, the influx of these groups is taxing the Muslim infrastructure, the Muslim educational infrastructure. Because you have these groups converting to Islam, and when they come and want to convert to Islam, typically the practice of the Prophet ﷺ was to say, okay, I will accept your Islam, but I'm going to send someone with you to teach you the faith. And he would send 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or 20, depending on the situation. People who would leave their home, take their family. Sometimes some of them didn't even take their families, but it depends on who we're talking about. But basically, they would make a huge sacrifice, right? Because they're leaving their home, they're leaving their livelihood, they're leaving their business, and they're relocating and going with the tribe or the clan that converted to Islam. You see, these details, they don't teach you in the seerah, but they're extremely important because they tell you what type of commitment is necessary to support Allah's cause and for Allah to support us. We hear about the wars, but we are never taught about a huge sacrifice, and those are the teachers. A clan, a tribe comes and converts, so the Prophet ﷺ nominates certain individuals and say, you will go relocate and go stay with this tribe for a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year, depending, to teach them, educate them in Islam, and then after the mission is done, you return to Medina. It's an army of educators, and they're very critical. They play a critical role, and what is sad is on some occasions, the Prophet ﷺ sent an educational delegation, and it was a trap. Or the group that converted to Islam reneged. And on some occasions, very sadly, we're going to talk about a couple of these incidents, inshallah, later. Of course, if we do the Sirah project, that's a complete narrative in itself. And it's one that I've never heard a Muslim talk about, which is unbelievable. But whether the tribe reneges or the tribe actually intended it as a deception from the beginning, they then hurt these teachers. They either killed them, in one incident they tortured them, they put out their eyes and blinded them, and basically put them in the sun without water to suffer thirst and so on, and die from thirst. So there is a risk. There is a risk that the people that you're going with would turn on you, and that creates a level of anxiety. And as we will see in Surah Al-Hujurat, we will see this. We'll talk about it. That creates a level of anxiety. Okay, this is my jihad. Is that I have to go. Do I take my family? What if it turns out to be a trap? Well, if it's a trap, it's not just me who's going to be killed, but my wife and my children will be sold into slavery, in all likelihood. So, do I leave my family and go until I know it's safe, and then bring my family along? But what if, and we have this in the Sirah, in several instances, we have where the family of the wife would object and say, well, you go on your jihad for 3 or 6 months or whatnot, but we don't want our daughter to leave Medina. We want her to stay in Medina. These were social issues that came up. And the bigger the number of tribes converting to Islam, the more the tension upon the social infrastructure and the infrastructure of mujahids, of committed Muslims who are willing to sacrifice, the greater the amount of tension upon that infrastructure. And we will see how all of this becomes very relevant to understanding Surah Al-Hujurat. And in light of this, what does Surah Al-Hujurat, what is the moral point, the ethical lesson of Surah Al-Hujurat? And all the very late revelation, methodologically, as well as pedagogically, seem to bear particular significance, because there is this issue of, well, now, as Surah Al-Ma'idah says, Allah is completing your faith for you. So, on the one hand, we have to consider the fact that it was not given a priority at the beginning. But on the other hand, we have to consider the fact that Allah was on some issues, comes at the very end and underscores these issues. They were raised earlier, like the issue of ghaibah, the issue of backbiting. It was raised before, repeatedly, but then it comes in Surah Al-Hujurat towards the end, and Allah underscores it as a possibly an issue that could decide your fate, that could possibly define the social mores and social ethics of your society. One last point before we delve in is that it was also obvious that the Prophet ﷺ has led a long, grueling mission from everything that occurred in Mecca to the enormously demanding undertakings in Medina, all the stress, all the battles, all the sieges, all the issues with his wives, all the issues where he lived and witnessed the passing away of his children, one after the other, girls and boys. So this is a man who's lost every child except, of course, for Fatima Zahra. And so if you're talking about tests, this is a man that has been burdened time and time and time and time again. And now, although in the Mecca period, he is surrounded by a group of people where he basically can know everyone by name. Now, in Medina, the first half of Medina, the number of Muslims is steadily increasing, but yet the constant recurring battles means that he has loved and lost a considerable number of people. And the Prophet, and again, this is, if we ever do the seerah thing, the Prophet ﷺ, the way he navigates and mediates these constant traumas in life, the demands of his wives, and the political situations of his wives, and the numerous challenges that he had to deal with in Medina, and the constant loss of children and loved ones, is with dhikr. It is not an exaggeration to say ibadah and dhikr, and this is an entire story in itself, that the way he handles all of this is a man basically who's constantly going back to Allah and communing with Allah. But now we add another element, and that is the demands placed on him by these new converts to Islam who don't know him very well, don't know him personally, and are bringing in an element of set of new demands and new stresses, and the sort of pressing issue of what type of norms does the Quran demand of someone who is in a place of trustship, like the Prophet ﷺ, and of those that deal with the Prophet ﷺ. And you get a sense of, nearly a sense of the of the pressure, or I don't know how to the right words, the pressure or the stress or the very real life practical demands upon the Prophet ﷺ from the opening of the surah. The surah begins right away without an introduction. It sort of just delves into the topic as if to say to you, before I give you a larger point, the micro level dynamics have to be anchored upon sound foundations. Before you get to a more abstract point, if you will, your ABCs have to be right. Your structure has to be right. So immediately it starts, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. And we'll notice in the surah there are Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you who believe, is repeated I think 5 times. And Ya ayyuha nas, not O believers but O people, is repeated once. And we'll see why this is significant. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله إن الله سميع عليم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله إن الله سميع عليم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. So, لا تقدموا, it's it's an idiomatic expression. So if you say in classical Arabic, لا تقدم بين يدي الإمام, or لا تقدم بين يدي الأب, what it means is they call it استعارة تمثيلية in Arabic. They call it استعارة تمثيلية. So that it's like saying, don't jump ahead of the imam, or don't jump ahead of your father. If you say لا تقدم بين يدي الأب, means don't cut them off. Don't try to preempt them by stepping ahead of them. It's a subtle point of respect and reverence. It's like saying, be mindful of your place so that you are not, whether intentionally or not, stepping ahead of who you should not step ahead of. And practically, it means do not لا تعجلوا بالقول أو الفعل. So, look, don't, whether well-intentioned or not, don't rush to make a point or to do something without being mindful of whether this is disrespectful to the Prophet ﷺ, whether this undermines the place of the Prophet. So be mindful of yourself. So Muhammad Asad translates it as, "Do not put yourselves forward." It's not. Don't commend yourself, if that what's put yourselves forward means. But it's not that. It's la tuqaddimu means that do not preempt or act in a way that is not mindful of your place vis-a-vis the Prophet ﷺ. What is important here is that this includes rushing to, and as we'll see the importance of that as the surah goes on, rushing to make judgments, rushing to take actions, either without consulting with the Prophet when you should consult, or as importantly, without being mindful of what the Prophet, whether this would please the Prophet or not. And we'll see why this becomes really critical. The Prophet is amongst you right now, living amongst you, and being mindful of what reverence and what respect is due to Allah and due to the Prophet is a habit. So develop this habit, because your numbers are increasing, and some of you, especially these new converts to Islam and the swelling of the number of Muslims, are not mindful. This is not part of their habit. The significance of this, beyond the occasion for the context of revelation, you see, Muslims in their history until the modern age was influenced by a very odd, ironically anti-prophetic movement, the Wahhabi movement, which didn't care much for loving the Prophet. I mean, on the one hand, they insisted on following the Sunnah of the Prophet, but on the other hand, they fought the idea of revering the Prophet. But beyond the Prophet being alive and amongst us, how can you revere the Prophet and not preempt the Prophet? How can you be mindful of what the Prophet would approve of or not approve of unless you know the Prophet? You see, if you look at the amount of poetry created in the Islamic civilization expressing intense love for the Prophet ﷺ, if you look even at the Qawwali tradition in South Asia, the whole spread of Islam in Indonesia, and some of the most beautiful things. I was in Indonesia and I attended a performance of a Sufi. It was a family, but what they sang, they gave me a translation of the poem they sang. It was just a beautiful poem. The mother and father and brother were the ones who played the musical instruments, and the daughter was the one who did the singing. And I will never forget that performance, because it was a beautiful, and the way Islam spread in places like Indonesia and Malaysia and so on was through the love of the Prophet. Hubb al-Rasul. Muslims in modernity are not taught to love their prophet. They hardly know their prophet. And so being mindful of, well, would the prophet approve of me acting this way? It's not a matter of do I imitate the prophet in the way the prophet drinks, or the way the prophet sat down, or the way the prophet dressed. Do I know the prophet so I act in a way that is truly mindful of what would disappoint or not disappoint the prophet? Well, how is that possible unless you know him? And you know him, and you know what type of model, what type of character, what type of personality did the Prophet ﷺ model for us. You see, that's why Islamophobia is so dangerous, because when they struck at the Prophet, they struck at the very heart of Islam. They struck at the model. You can't take the Prophet Muhammad out of Islam and still have Islam. So now, when Hershey Ali, and I know probably you guys don't follow what Hershey Ali says, but in book after book, including her latest, it is an unrelenting attack on the character of the Prophet. And her idiotic point is that, well, what we need is for Muslims to reform by realizing how immoral their prophet is. We're going to respect their right to be Muslims. Yeah, we as Americans have no problem with them being Muslims and even being devout Muslims. But as long as they realize that their prophet was immoral and that he was no model, well, you know what? It doesn't work. That's a dead, murdered, deceased, buried and gone Islam. You're not going to have an Islam with a malign prophet. And unfortunately, I mean, even look at all the read. I mean, one of the most popular books, Martin Ling's, about the life of the Prophet. You read all the modern literature. You read the entire thing from cover to cover, and you feel that you've learned very little about the personality of the Prophet. They tell you a lot of data. He did this, he went here, he did this, that, fought this battle, but came back. But being mindful, لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله, because it's not just the Prophet, but Allah and the Prophet. It's really a tall call, a tall order. If you don't have that mindfulness, the sense of who the Prophet was as a human being. Okay. So, mindfulness of Allah and His Prophet. And it's a self-censoring mechanism, because the very beginning is that don't say anything, don't take any action without being mindful of Allah and the Prophet. لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله. Don't say anything, don't do anything without being mindful. Okay. From that general prescription, then it goes specifically an example of the mindfulness. And it chooses something that is quite micro. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. So it is Allah repeats, when Allah repeats Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, it is a call of intimacy. It's like when I say, my son, X, Y, and Z, my son, listen to me, X, Y, and Z. What I'm doing is it's an expression of intimacy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sort of, when it says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, and repeats it, Allah is going through to your conscience, to your very heart, and saying, I need you to understand this at the most essential, existential level. And the example that Allah takes of mindfulness vis-a-vis the Prophet, especially, والسلام, is quite remarkable, because Allah could have chosen, any of the big examples. But Allah chooses something that takes a great deal of sensitivity and taste to illustrate to you what mindfulness is. Now, and what is this example? The tone of your voice. In the tradition, you read reports that say that some people would fast it's known as Yawm al-Shak. Yawm al-Shak means that they're not sure if Ramadan is on Thursday or Friday, so they would fast a day early just to be safe. And in these traditions, you read that this revelation was intended to tell them, stop doing that. Meaning, just follow what the Prophet tells you and stop trying to go beyond what the Prophet tells you. Other traditions say, no, this was revealed because people would come in Eid al-Adha. This is the Eid where you sacrifice animals and you distribute the meat and so on. They would slaughter the animals before Salat al-Eid, not after Salat al-Eid. And then, so this Quranic revelation basically is telling them to stop doing that. Interestingly, Bukhari, I remember reading in Bukhari's Tarikh, in his book that he wrote, his history book, not his hadith, he mentions there that this surah was revealed, or this ayah was revealed because people used to fast Yawm al-Shak, or they would fast a day early, or 2 days early. None of these reports you can rely on. I mean, I think that early interpreters of the Quran thought that this ayah was relevant to these issues, but eventually, in some of the traditions, they were reported as occasions for revelation rather than as interpretations by Ibn Abbas or Ibn Mas'ud. just so you know. As to raising the voice, in the tradition, you read some interesting narratives. One of them was that if I remember correctly, this was reported by Abdullah ibn Zubair. That Abdullah ibn Zubair, according to this narrative, that an Arab tribe known as Banu Tamim they sent a delegation to the Prophet ﷺ because Banu Tamim wanted to convert to Islam. The story of the delegation of Banu Tamim is very relevant to Surah Al-Hujurat in general because they feature in this drama in several roles. And the delegation from Banu Tamim, so I do believe that Surah Al-Hujurat was revealed around the time that a delegation from Banu Tamim arrived. And that helps us in dating the surah because the delegation from Banu Tamim came to Medina in the late 8th century Hijrah or the early 9th century Hijrah. Anyway, so Abdullah ibn Zubair says that there is a delegation from Banu Tamim that arrived and they expressed an interest in learning Islam, and Abu Bakr recommended that the Prophet ﷺ appoint Al-Qa'qa' bin Ma'bad as the head of the educational delegation that would go back with Banu Tamim. So Al-Qa'qa' bin Ma'bad would be the one who would be in charge of the 10 or 20 people who are going to go back with Banu Tamim to teach them Islam. And that Umar ibn al-Khattab disagreed and said, no, appoint Al-Aqra' bin Habis. I know for you right now, these names don't mean anything, but yeah. So Omar says, no, appoint Al-Aqra' bin Habis as the head of the delegation. And according to this report, that Abu Bakr and Omar get into an argument about their recommendations. And the argument gets heated. And their voices are raised. And when the Prophet ﷺ hears their voices raised, he comes out of his room and is very disappointed. And that was the reason, the occasion for the revelation. What's interesting is that while this tradition is reported, it's reported in a number of different versions. The most authentic of these versions is that this incident, this heated discussion where their voices got raised a bit, took place after the revelation of Surah Al-Hujurat, not before. And that when the Prophet ﷺ came out, he reminded them of of this ayah, and that's when their voices came down. Now, there is another narrative that is of a higher level of authenticity about a man who's a very interesting man called Thabit bin Qais bin Shammas. Thabit bin Qais was a very interesting Sahabi in many different levels. And I would have loved to meet him. Well, I mean, there are a lot of people that I would love to meet in history. But anyway, Thabit was hard of hearing. And because he was hard of hearing, as his hearing got worse, the worse his hearing got, the louder his voice became. So people noticed that he seemed to be often talking and like he would be shouting when he talks. Anyway, so that when this surah was revealed, Thabit bin Qais became convinced that the reason the surah was revealed is to chide him for raising his voice in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. Because he was told several times, do you notice that you tend to be yelling when you're talking to the Prophet, and others, of course. And he became extremely distressed that he isolated himself at home and sort of withdrew into the shell of his home, because he became convinced that the Prophet ﷺ is disappointed in him, and that Allah came to basically tell him how that he's the one intended. And the Prophet ﷺ noticed that Thabit bin Qais has not come around and is not showing up, and he asked about him. And they told him that Thabit, since the revelation of Hujurat, Thabit has entered into a deep depression, and he's praying at his home and has cut off himself from people. And so the Prophet ﷺ called for him. And in the narrative, there is a medieval aspect that is probably not authentic to this narrative, where the Prophet ﷺ says, what saddened you? And he said, I thought that Allah is angry with me. And that the Prophet ﷺ tells him or predicts that that in fact Allah could not be angry at him because he's going to end up being a martyr. And indeed, Thabit is martyred in the Battle of Mu'tah, about a year later. That part of the narrative, that sort of typically medieval thing where in the narrative, the Prophet predicts the end of the hero and tells the hero that your end will be heroic, is sort of a medieval prototype that I am very doubtful about, that I am very suspicious, is sort of added to a narrative later. While I think that it is probably historical that Thabit bin Qais, it fits for many different reasons. Thabit bin Qais, in fact, got sad and got so alarmed and depressed, and that the Prophet ﷺ asked about him, and then the Prophet told him, no, you're not the intended person by this surah. This is not the raising of voice that the surah is talking about. And that Thabit then became very happy, and then eventually he was martyred in Mu'tah. All of that I believe. Anyway, but none of it, I think, is um, an occasion, necessarily an occasion for revelation. The occasion for revelation is precisely what the beginning of Surah Al-Hujurat says, وَلَا تُقَدِّمُوا بَيْنَ يَدَيِ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, that be mindful, don't step ahead of Allah and His Prophet. And you want a practical example of this, your tone of voice. From this, in the Islamic tradition, if you read Sufi books, among the things they teach you, it is a grave error and sin to cut off your teacher or to raise your voice to your teacher, as it is a sin to raise your voice to your parents. I know that, our modern world doesn't emphasize this. But you don't raise your voice to people who are older than you. You don't raise your voice to your parents. You absolutely don't raise your voice to your teacher. You don't cut off your teacher. You don't show off before your teacher. You don't try to be more impressive than your teacher. All of these became anchored in the Islamic tradition. Because of this Quranic narrative and what the Prophet ﷺ taught about this Quranic narrative. So, the tone of your voice. Why the tone of your voice? Because it is an indication of your self-control. Among the things that we have the hardest time controlling is your tongue and your tone and your attitude. The hardest things. Sometimes they're even harder than giving money. Although as Muslims these days, it seems everything except the most superficial is hard. Your tone and your attitude, because your tone and your attitude are indications of your strength, your inner patience, your inner forbearance, and your patience. These are the indications of how you are inside. Are you strong, or are you not in control? Fundamentally a weak human being. Because if these are impulses, the impulse to raise your voice in frustration, it's an impulse. And learning to control your impulse is a habit. So here you are presented with sort of the quintessential example of self-control. Can you do it? Can you be so mindful that, and in the presence of the Prophet, ﷺ, لا تجهروا, that being mindful of the Prophet and his role means that you don't speak to the Prophet the way that you speak to each other. So while you might speak to each other, you take liberties. But there's a point of reverence and order. Unless you learn part of the building blocks of society, is a structure of respect. We are coded to respect. Now, if you don't respect your parents, you don't respect your teachers, you don't respect the learned, you're going to respect something else. You're going to respect those who hold power. You're going to respect, in our days, I guess, belly dancers and rock stars and actors and actresses. You are coded to have a sense of reverence. Who do you have a sense of reverence towards? And so in Surah Al-Hujurat, and you'll see how this ties into the entire message of the surah, inshallah, in a little bit. In Surah Al-Hujurat, it comes at this point, and for the old Muslims and for the new Muslims, it comes and says, examine, reflect upon, contemplate your entire edifice of reverence. Are you aware? Because this is very critical for your entire value system. Okay. And look at أن تحبط أعمالكم. A remarkable expression, because it's saying lest, the way it's translated by Asad is, lest all your good deeds come to naught without you perceiving it. Meaning, normally in all the tafsir, they understand this as lest Allah takes away your good points, your credit, your brownie points for your good deeds. But أن تحبط أعمالكم doesn't necessarily just mean that. أن تحبط أعمالكم, it's like saying, lest your deeds amount, because in the translation, Hamad Asad puts, like most translators, good deeds in brackets. So it's like but the literal translation is, lest your deeds amount to nothing. Wow. So if I am not mindful of Allah, and I'm not mindful of the Prophet, and if I don't learn to internalize who the Prophet ﷺ was, and to be in reverence of this Prophet, so that I think, before I take an action, would the Prophet approve? Even before I marry someone. This is one of the things that in the law, in the bygone days, when I used to get invited to Islamic organizations, and I remember I gave a lecture once that the organizers, for some reason, didn't like. And that is, they asked me to, I was very young, I was in my 20s, and they asked me to talk about marriage to these young folks. So my model, I said, well, when you decide, when you're thinking about marrying or not marrying someone, think of what the Prophet ﷺ would say. Would the Prophet approve of the marriage or disapprove of the marriage? And of course, the lecture was for an hour, so I went and gave them some examples from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ about people he approved of and people he disapproved of. And as you would expect, there's an ethical message in all of these, as we will see in Surah Al-Hujurat as well, in one of the narratives. And I don't know what was so controversial about this. I mean, it wasn't that anyone came, but they just didn't invite me again. And they, I heard that they're like, oh, he's telling the youth he's emboldening the youth against their parents. I don't know, how is that emboldening the youth against against their parents to tell them, would the Prophet, if the Prophet ﷺ was alive, would you ask the Prophet's blessings, or are you sure the Prophet wouldn't give his blessings? What could be more straightforward than that? But this is precisely the kind of reverence that you have to have for the Prophet ﷺ. Not a theoretical construct, not a historical figure that is dead and gone, but the spirit of the Prophet is living with you. That's following the sunnah of the Prophet. Not the beard, not the water, how you drink water, not the swag, the spirit of the Prophet. If he was living with you, would he like what you're doing? Would he like what you're deciding? Would he like what you're buying? Would he like what you're spending your money on? Would he like the way you're spending your time? That's being mindful of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so أن تحبط أعمالكم, because if you don't learn that system of reverence and respect, you don't realize it, but you will amount to nothing. You will think you're building, you think that you have social structures and goals and moral purposes, but it starts at the micro level. Okay. إن الذين ينادونك من وراء الحجرات أكثرهم لا يعقلون ولو أنهم صبروا حتى تخرج إليهم لكان خيرا لهم والله غفور رحيم. Okay, so those who call upon you or call out to you من وراء الحجرات, so the Prophet ﷺ is in his private apartment, and those who call out, "O Muhammad, come out. O Muhammad, we want to talk to you." And they should be patient until you come out to meet them. So, there is, I don't know if I wrote it somewhere. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's why I forgot a point. Please go back to verse 3 again. About lowering your voice. Notice this expression. الذين يغضون أصواتهم عند رسول الله أولئك الذين امتحن الله قلوبهم للتقوى. So Muhammad Asad translates امتحن الله قلوبهم للتقوى, that God has tested and opened to consciousness of God and opened their consciousness to God. In other words, what he's saying. And then there shall be forgiveness. Now, but you pause at that expression, امتحن الله قلوبهم. Why? imtihan al-qalb is, the expression here is, or the pivotal point is that expression lil taqwa, for piety. Allah tested their hearts for piety. It is like saying Allah molded their hearts through difficult tests. Why? In order to achieve real taqwa. So the expression lil taqwa, lam at-ta'lil, this lam at-ta'lil, أتت لأداء الواجب, as they say in Arabic. So lam at-ta'lil is to say that they have been tested for the purposes of achieving taqwa. And it warrants a pause, because you say, I've tested you, or you'd say, I prepared you, I trained you for battle, right? I've armed you for victory. I supported you for X, Y, and Z. So here Allah comes and says, what I've done by teaching you to control your impulse when it comes to proper reverence of Allah and the Prophet ﷺ, and especially the example given here is about the Prophet. What I've done is I've molded your heart through this example so that you can achieve real taqwa. Which is startling, because it's like saying real taqwa, true piety, which is a consistent theme in Surah Al-Hujurat, by the way. Real piety is not going to be achieved unless the reverence of the Prophet and the ability to control your impulse when reverence is due is inside of you. And imtahan Allah tested them. The imtahan is when, like, for instance, the way you purify minerals is through heat. That's called imtihan. So it is through the difficult test of demanding that you control your impulse and build up the system of reverence within you and the system of deference within you, where you say, I know when it's appropriate to defer and who to defer to. And when Allah says imtahan, then it means Allah is saying, I know this is very difficult, but this is how I sear it, this is how I mold it, this is how I build it. So now you go to those who call you from behind the private rooms. And there is a narrative that is rather interesting about this, is that well, there are a few of them, but okay. So the delegation from Yamama Yamama is a complicated tribe. I'm not going to get too much into the history of tribes, and I mean, although it's fascinating, and if we knew our history, we would be anyway. So Yamama is a complicated tribe. It's a large tribe, but it is a very Bedouin tribe that's gruff and hard and needed a lot of tenderizing. Islam, the values of Islam needed to elevate them and civilize them. And so when the delegation comes, according to this narrative, that there is a well-known leader in Yamama and also a well-known poet called Al-Aqra. And Al-Aqra was a well-known pre-Islamic poet. I mean, not famous among the average Muslim scholar, but anyway. Al-Aqra ibn Hamis. So anyway, Al-Aqra ibn Hamis arrives and he starts calling out, Muhammad, come out. Muhammad, where are you? The Prophet ﷺ didn't answer. It's sort of rude. He's in his private quarters and there's a man standing there demanding that he comes out. And for the habits of the Bedouins, well, I arrived in Medina with my delegation. You must come out to meet me immediately. And meeting the lower in ranks, the companions, and Ali ibn Abi Talib is not good enough. We need Muhammad himself. We want to talk to Muhammad about our conversion. But Al-Aqra turns out to have wanted something that is very Bedouin and very Arab. What he wanted is mubarazat al-tafakhur. He wanted to have a match where the first thing the tribe is going to do is present their poet to brag about the lineage and history and mythology of his tribe and compete with the poet representing Muslims in Medina, Hassan ibn Thabit. And in this competition, the two poets would go ahead in pre-Islamic practice. The irony is that tribes would do this, and it was intended as a gesture at the beginning of friendship. So friendship and relationships between tribes cannot be launched without this battle between the poets of each tribe bragging about the achievements and history and ancestry of their own tribe. But the irony is it would often backfire and lead to war. Because the poets, and then there would be huge disagreement as to who the winner is, and then there would be hard feelings because the poets would start going at each other. Well, my tribe is better than your tribe because your tribe, is this and that. And very jahili, very tribal. But you know what? When I hear a lot of Muslims talk about their countries today, my folks, for instance, Egyptians talk about Egypt, Dunya, and vis-a-vis, I know some Egyptians who love Trump just because Trump humiliated Saudi Arabia when he said to the king, we protect you without us 2 weeks, king, you must pay. And they're willing to forgive anything that Trump does just because he humiliated Saudi Arabia. And I'm just reminded they have reverted to Jahiliyyah in every sense of the word. It's just that at least the Jahilis, what came out of it was good poetry. They don't even have that today. But so Al-Aqra tells the Prophet, we want this mubaraza, we want this because we've arrived and we want you guys to understand how wonderful our tribe is, and we want to hear what your poet has to say about you. And the Prophet ﷺ says, no, we don't engage in this anymore. The only merit is taqwa. And we don't talk about ancestry, and we don't talk about our lineage, and we don't talk about how we invaded this, and we killed this, and we've done this, and so on. But what's interesting is Al-Aqra and Hassan ibn Thabit. Hassan ibn Thabit is the poet that usually defended Muslims or represented Muslims. Somehow end up going at it. Now, it's very interesting because the tradition doesn't tell us except that it happened later, and it doesn't seem that the Prophet ﷺ was around. So the Prophet refused to engage in it, but Hassan ibn Thabit and Al-Aqra somehow ended up going at it through poetry. So Al-Aqra recites poetry about how his tribe is, superior to everyone on the face of the earth. And Hassan ibn Thabit is talking about we Muslims are this and we Muslims are that. And that commentaries, some of the reports say that the revelation of Surah Al-Hujurat up to that point, يُنَادُونَكَ مِنْ وَرَاءِ الْحُجُرَاتِ, that it was intended to condemn this incident. Again, make a long story short, I very much doubt, and the evidence is extremely weak, that the revelation was because of this. I don't doubt the historical event itself, but likely the historical event even took place after the revelation of Surah Al-Hujurat, not before. There is another narrative about again this ayah about nida' min wara' al-hujurat, those who call out to you, is that Muslims were raided upon. There was a tribe called Hay Bani Ambar. So these folks, there were sheep grazing belonging to Ansar, some members of the Ansar in Medina, and these folks came and raided the flock and took off with so on. And so Muslims went out in what is called the Sariya, a small platoon, to discipline them, because if you don't take military action against raiders, then in the law of the time, you become open season on you. And when the Muslim force approached Hay Bani Ambar, these guys, being sort of making their living out of highway robbery, didn't have very high principles or morals. So Hay bin Anbar, the men fled and left all their women and children behind. They didn't want, they knew that if the Muslims by then had a very fearsome reputation. They didn't think the Muslims were going to come after them, but Muslims did. And so they absconded and left. So Muslims went back with the women and children as prisoners of war. They brought them back to Medina. And then the Banu Ambar sent a representative to negotiate with Muslims for the release of their family, their women and children, and whoever was captured. And upon arrival in Medina, the narrative goes, is that they started yelling out to Muhammad, "Oh Muhammad, come out, we need to talk to you, we need to talk to you right now." And that the narrative says that when the Prophet ﷺ came, they said, "We want to negotiate with you about terms of releasement." And the Prophet had already decided to release half of them for no return. And so he negotiated with them about the releasing the other half for a sum of money, as was the practice back then. And the narrative goes on to say that if they were more patient and were not obnoxious and rude, that the Prophet would have released the entire population of prisoners for nothing. So it is their impatience and intransigence that sort of caused the Prophet to release half for nothing and half for ransom. This report is extremely doubtful. Now, for one thing, it doesn't tell us at all how does the narrator know that the Prophet would have released the entire flock for nothing. And if it is the rudeness of these people that made Muslims say, okay, we'll only release half for nothing, but the other half you have to ransom. It doesn't tell us that. There's no specifics, there are no details. The other thing is that it is, compared to the report of Al-Aqra bin Hamis, for instance, it's much weaker. And for an event that would have been so significant, you would have expected it to be reported by a far greater number of people, so that you have cumulative narrations. But you don't. It's pretty much an isolated narrative going through a particular chain of people. So, while again, I don't doubt that we know that Hay bin Ambar was there. We know who these people are, and we know that they convert to Islam eventually. And I probably, at some basic level, there's truth to them negotiating with Muslims for the release of their captives. Whatever the terms of that negotiation was, is lost to history. But the fact that Banu Ambar convert to Islam shortly after, it exemplifies something that we see repeatedly in the Seerah, that people would be impressed by how Muslims treated the captives. So impressed that they would enter into Islam because of it. They sort of like, because these people had actually, sense of honor. If you treated my family well, it's something that I remember, something that would affect me, something that would have a very serious impact on me. And so again, and if we we study the Sirah, then we talk about the details of so many of these examples where treatment of family or tribe members leads to spreading God's word, humane and dignified treatment. So, whatever the terms of the release were, obviously, I mean, it didn't make Bani Ambar sworn enemies. It actually brought them to the fold shortly after. But as an occasion for revelation of Surah Al-Hujurat, I doubt. Or these parts of this part of Surah Al-Hujurat, I very much doubt. Especially when we get to why this surah is known as Surah Al-Hujurat. Now, notice here, what it's saying is, those who do not, in our modern language, right, that those who do not know how to respect private space, and they do not know how to show sufficient or proper deference to private space, and those who do not inside of them know the difference between dealing with a prophet, the same idea of reverence and respect within society, that there is a problem. Now, keep this in mind, because the idea of private space and the prohibition against spying and snooping and backbiting, in other words, violating the intimacies of human beings, is central to the surah. So it starts out by giving you an example of this type of reverence and respect before it goes on to show you how this is a more general, abstract ethic. So it's very interesting, because it goes from the micro level and will take you to the more general level, but it sort of exemplifies it for you with these concrete examples of, can you control yourself? Which is amazing, because, yeah, the challenge in backbiting is a level of self-control and discipline to entertain the self and busy the self with the self rather than the other. Turns out to be one of the toughest challenges that human beings confront. Okay, let's take a short break. Okay. So then, يا أيها الذين آمنوا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه. Again, Allah uses the intimate call, يا أيها الذين آمنوا. And takes you to another point of social ethics. إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا أن تصيبوا قوما بجهالة فتصبحوا على ما فعلتم نادمين. واعلموا أن فيكم رسول الله لو يطيعكم في كثير من الأمر لعنتم ولكن الله حبب إليكم الإيمان وزينه في قلوبكم وكره إليكم الكفر والفسوق والعصيان أولئك هم الراشدون فضلا من الله ونعمة والله عليم حكيم. So 6 and 7 there is there's a group of traditions about 6 verse 6 because the meaning is clear enough that if you receive information, it is incumbent upon you to investigate, to consider the source of the information, and that if there is any reason for you to doubt the source of information, you must investigate and to be aware, because if you act upon information unjustly, the consequences could be not good for you, meaning you bear responsibility for acting upon suspicion or doubt and so on. So there is a man called Al-Haris bin Dirar al-Khuzai, and Ben al-Mustaliq, which is again another tribal group, and there is years earlier and a military confrontation with this tribe, Ben al-Mustaliq, and they convert to Islam eventually. But so Al-Haris bin Dirar al-Khuzai, who's from Banu al-Mustaliq, and he comes to, he's representing Banu al-Mustaliq, and he comes to Medina, and he had converted to Islam, and he, after staying in Medina for a while, he tells the Prophet ﷺ that he is going to make it a point to teach Islam to members of his tribe, and to sort of, dedicate himself to teaching his tribe about their religion. And the tradition says that he also makes an agreement with Medina that he will be the person responsible for collecting the taxes due to the central government in Medina. Because once you become Muslim, you pay your taxes to the central government of Medina. What's interesting, of course, is that in books of tradition it says that he agreed to collect the zakah. But this is another issue. I'm convinced that when it said zakah, this point and early on in Islamic sources, it didn't just mean the 2.5% that is due every يحول عليها الحول every year, but it included all forms of kharaj, all forms of taxations. Anyway, so he would become the person responsible for collecting the zakah, and then Medina would send a representative to come receive this money and take it back to the central government in Medina, sort of to the public treasury. And as the narrative goes, that Al-Harith bin Darar waits for the representative from Medina when the time comes time to hand over the money from the treasury. A representative from Medina doesn't arrive. They had agreed on a certain time and a certain place, and he doesn't arrive. And keeps waiting for him, and no one shows up. And Haris bin Darar tells his folks in Banu Mustaliq, I know the Prophet, and this is not like him. If he says he'll send a representative, we agreed on a time and a place, and something is wrong. And Al-Haris bin Darar starts worrying that the Prophet or the government in Medina, the central government in Medina, are upset with him or with Banu Mustaliq. Why haven't they sent a representative? So eventually he decides to travel to Medina himself. Meanwhile, what he doesn't know is that the Prophet ﷺ indeed did appoint a man, Al-Walid bin Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt. Al-Walid bin Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt is appointed as the person who bears the responsibility of going to Banu Mustaliq and collecting the taxes. But what happens then is a very interesting historical point, because it is clear that Al-Walid bin Uqba doesn't make it to Banu Mustaliq. The question is why. He starts on his journey to Banu Mustaliq according to the agreed upon time and place to collect the taxes, but he turns around and he comes back to Medina and he tells the Prophet that he didn't continue on with the journey because Banu Mustaliq he becomes convinced that they have hostile intentions and that they intend to, remember I told you at the beginning that some of the Prophet's delegates, whether teachers or otherwise, would be betrayed and would be murdered or tortured. Well, Al-Walid bin Uqba apparently becomes convinced that this was the intent of Banu Mustaliq. And that Banu Mustaliq, it was a trap, that he would go to Banu Mustaliq and that they would kill him or torture him. And so he turns around and he tells the folks in Medina and the Prophet ﷺ that Banu Mustaliq have hostile intention and that this was a trap and they don't intend to pay the taxes and so on. And when Al-Haris bin Darar arrives in Medina, directly he goes to see the Prophet, and the Prophet ﷺ says, do you know that we were preparing a military posse to it was reported to us that Al-Walid bin Uqba had said that you've turned hostile, and this was, treachery was involved, and that you violated your agreements, and that basically we were going to send a military force to find out what's going on. And of course, Al Harith bin Dirar says that's absolutely not true. We had not reneged. In fact, I was waiting for the tax collector. He never arrived. And what's interesting about this narrative then is what happened that made Al-Walid bin Uqba convinced that Banu Mustaliq had hostile intentions. And what makes this even more interesting, it would have been possible to say that Al-Walid bin Uqba simply, was an immoral, unethical human being, except for the fact that Al-Walid bin Uqba actually, as a person, has a good track record in serving the Islamic cause. So he's not a person with questionable credibility. Some sources say that as he approached the area of Banu Mustaliq, that a faction of Banu Mustaliq who didn't like the authority of Harith bin Dirar, didn't like the authority of Harith bin Dirar, and didn't like the fact that Harith bin Dirar was collecting taxes for the central, that they preempted the journey and threatened him or somehow scared him off. Now, why is this significant? Well, in part because what the Quran says, إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَأٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. If a fasiq, and a fasiq is an iniquitous person, is a person who is a sinner. So, if this is in fact the occasion for revelation, for Allah to call someone like Al-Walid bin Uqba a fasiq is a very big deal. And is he a fasiq because he didn't do his due diligence? So if the sort of ethical inquiry and the legal inquiry is failure to discharge your obligations to verify the facts, what makes you a fasiq or not a fasiq? So it is not the fact that you are a person of questionable character or not questionable character, because Walid bin Uqba was not a person of questionable character. But it is if the circumstances should inform you that this person did not do their due diligence, obliviousness to the facts, and if this was the occasion, and if they would have acted on the information that Al-Walid bin Uqba, and possibly, it's possible, that there would have been some type of military confrontation out of this misunderstanding. And most Muslim scholars said the answer is yes. That when the Quran says, إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ, the Quran is partly telling you, consider who you're getting the information from. But especially telling you, consider whether the person communicating the information was in a position or has in fact performed due diligence in verifying the veracity of the information, and that your failure to engage in this process of satisfying yourself that the information you are receiving is credible, and if you act upon this information, then you in turn incur a sin because you should have known. And in the Islamic tradition, Muslims, especially in a book like Ihya Ulumuddin, if you read how much Ghazali wrote about this, he wrote pages and pages, and tells you many narratives and many reports about your obligation in the same way that Allah anchors you in a sense of reverence as to what Allah wants and what the Prophet wants, what the Prophet would do, what the Prophet would expect. Allah anchors you in self-control. Control the tone of your voice. Control your attitude. Know who you're speaking to. Know who you're dealing with. Allah anchors you in rules of etiquette that are socially defined. Allah also anchors you in an obligation not to be a lightweight who is swayed one direction because of rumors and another direction because of rumors. Conscientiousness in the way you make decisions and the way you take action based on these decisions. Okay. And then this point is brilliantly underscored by saying that understand what it means. Now, sort of understand your historical moment. Understand what it means to have the Prophet of God amongst you. Now, of course, in retrospect now, we can think back and say, wow, so this is being said because Allah knows that this Prophet will not be amongst them very long. To have the Prophet of Allah amongst you, and that the presence of this Prophet amongst you has saved you from numerous follies, because if this Prophet was a lightweight and had acted upon a lot of what you've told him, if he would have in fact reacted to the rumors that you conveyed to him, you would have experienced a lot of hardship. لَعَنِتُّمْ. So it's like saying the consequences of not verifying your sources and not being morally conscientious on the flow of information and the processing of information could be very disastrous. And know that you have a special blessing, that Allah حبب إليكم الإيمان وزينه في قلوبكم وكره إليكم الكفر والفسوق والعصيان. That for you, Allah blessed you with something very special. That Allah made Iman something that your hearts are attracted to, and made it sort of intervened to make that marriage between you and Iman and the special relationship that exists in this special moment, and that Allah, for so many of you, made al-kufr wal-fusuq wal-asyan, these three things. Kufr has to do with your heart. Fusuq, most commentators says, in this context, has to do with what your tongue utters, like lying and like backbiting. And asyan has to do with actions you commit. Al-amal بأركان الجسم بأعضاء الجسم. So that the fact that for this, so many of you, this core group, Allah had, you must understand that this is a special blessing. As numerous scholars of Islam have commented over centuries, the challenge for every Muslim individual or collectivity, every Muslim ummah, every age, is how to be mindful of the Prophet ﷺ enough so that Allah would bestow that blessing of حب الإيمان وتزيين الإيمان في القلب, so that Allah would, instead of making us full of doubt and anxiety and confusion, that Allah would the blessing of Allah would intervene to quieten our hearts and to comfort our spirits. Okay. So far, the picture of the context of Surah Al-Hujurat is building up, right? So there are delegations, there are people that don't know Islamic ethics very well and need to be educated and disciplined into the importance of social ethics in Islamic spaces, the importance of people learning what we can now call the Islamic way of life, if you will, meaning Islamic morality and ethics. And we see that by the 9th century Hijrah, that the picture of the challenges start becoming quite clear. In that there is it's a complex situation with numerous challenges, and that the core challenge is to maintain the ethical purpose of the Islamic trajectory. A new layer is then introduced to us in the following ayah. This is now 9. وإن طائفتان من المؤمنين اقتتلوا فاصلحوا بينهما فإن بغت إحداهما على الأخرى فقاتلوا التي تبغي حتى تفيء إلى أمر الله فإن فاءت فاصلحوا بينهما بالعدل واقسطوا إن الله يحب المقسطين إنما المؤمنون إخوة فاصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. Then Allah in 10 talks about what if in fact, you're confronted with a situation where the social ethics fail and Muslims end up fighting with each other. And there are quite a bit of narratives about this ayah. And if I would summarize them for you, I will start out with the least authentic of them. Many scholars, I think incorrectly, said that this ayah was a revelation that preempted, or that was the occasion for this revelation was the fitna that would occur between the Sahaba, the Imam Ali, and those who rebelled against them years later. So that Allah revealed this ayah for the specific purpose of addressing this situation that would occur years later. And this ayah did, in fact, play a very big role in the interpretive dynamics that takes place in the big fitna. But as an occasion for revelation, that's not, just the evidence is not there. There is another narrative that Sa'd bin Ibadah, one of the well-known companions, had fallen ill. And the Prophet ﷺ said, let's go visit Sa'd bin Ibadah. On the way to Sa'd bin Ibadah, they passed by they would pass by the home and diwaniyah of Abdullah ibn Ubay. Abdullah ibn Ubay is known as the head or the chief of the hypocrites in Medina, the dissenting group that we talked about. And as he saw the Prophet passing by, and the Prophet was riding on a donkey, Abdullah ibn Ubay made a rude comment. He said, the smell of your donkey is obnoxious and is bothering us. So keep your donkey away from us. Your donkey stinks, in other words. And when he said that, Abdullah bin Rawaha, who was among the Ansar, got very upset and yelled back at Abdullah ibn Ubay, the Prophet's donkey smells better than you. And when that happened, then the supporters of Abdullah bin Ubay went to blows with the supporters of Abdullah bin Rawaha and the Ansar, in other words. Now, this was the occasion. This is why this ayah was revealed. Now, it's very interesting, of course, because we have so many versions of this tradition, but it shows us several things. That whether this was an occasion for revelation or not, it's probably, just from how often it was reported, it's probably a historical event. It probably did happen in some version or form or another. But so late into the game, even by the 9th century Hijrah, this there's the opposition group still exists, and it doesn't just exist, but it's going strong because there is a sufficient number of them to come to the defense of Abdullah ibn Ubay and to insist that Abdullah ibn Ubay had the right to tell the Prophet, keep your stinky donkey away, and to go to blows with Muslims. And then if, and the number of scholars that said that this ayah applies to this situation is very interesting, because then it's referring to the hypocrites as mu'minun and even as ikhwa, as brothers. So this in Islamic law and Islamic ethics occupies a great deal of attention and becomes so although the party that is in the wrong could be even offensive towards, to this extent, sort of obnoxious, but still there's an obligation to make peace, and they still count as your brothers. Well, that has profound implications for what do you do with dissenters in an Islamic ummah, and the limits of the right to dissent, or in this case, the level of freedom to dissent. So there's a third narrative, and this third narrative again involves Abdullah ibn Ubay, but in the third narrative, the Prophet ﷺ again went to visit Sa'd bin Ubadah, and that after visiting Sa'd, who was ill, people sat down to listen to the Prophet, and the Prophet started talking. And that Abdullah ibn Ubay responded or interrupted the Prophet and said, "Why don't you stay home? And whoever wants to listen to you can then go to listen to you. But don't come here and disrupt or interrupt or disrupt, but don't come here basically and ruin the mood for us. So, just if someone wants to listen to you, they can go find you and seek you out. But you shouldn't come to where we are and basically impose whatever you're saying upon us." And then this descended into a fight between the supporters of Abdullah ibn Ubay and the supporters of the Prophet. But this narrative is even more, because here Abdullah ibn Ubay is not objecting to the smell of a donkey. Abdullah ibn Ubay is actually directly challenging the Prophet and saying, "We don't want to listen to you. You're bothering us." And still then the Quranic prescription to come and say they're still your brothers and make peace between them and calls them mu'minun was something that, I mean, if you're really interested in this, you can read the book I wrote on rebellion in Islamic law, because I go into all these reports, which I wrote many, many years ago, but just so much on them. it is very difficult to know. I mean, it is what is clear is that even this late, in the 9th century Hijrah, the dissenting faction, after a long history of even withdrawing from battle, conspiring with the Jewish tribes, posing a consistent narrative of opposition to the Prophet, continued to exist with rights in Medina. And we're not imprisoned, we're not exiled, we're not persecuted. And whether you do believe that these ayat apply to them so that they should be called ukhwa, which is very difficult for me to accept the idea that people that are this insolent with the Prophet should continue to be called brothers. So I must confess that, I find it, and I've always found it, after 30 years of research, because the Rebellion book was written like 30 years ago, I'm still very uncomfortable with the idea, a very liberal idea, that people like that can be referred to as brothers. But I must admit that it is sort of a gut feeling. If I would go with scholarship alone, with objective data, I would have to accept that they are called brothers by the Quran. I mean, a view that is even too tolerant for me to be able to just comfortably digest. But note that regardless, what it comes and says is that you have an obligation. If all breaks down and there is a disagreement or conflict between Muslims, your obligation is to call them all to unite upon the principle of God. تفيء لأمر الله. The priority here is agreeing on a mechanism to resolve the conflict and the principle of unity. If a party refuses to come to the principle of unity or to accept the idea of al-i'tisam bihablillah, or to anchor themselves around the principle of God, then you have an obligation to all unite against the deviant party. But justice remains a prevailing imperative, because فَاصْلِحُوا بَيْنَهُمَا بِالْعَدْلِ وَأَقْسِطُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُقْسِطِينَ. So the way this conflict must be resolved is injustice. The only decisive principle to resolve the conflict is the overriding principle of justice. Waqsitu, which again, and be fair. So you are fighting that the party that says justice or no justice, we don't want peace. But once this party accepts the principle of peace, you must rule justly. The whole conflict must be resolved through justice, which of course begs the question of all the complexities involved in vetting out justice. How do we understand justice? How do we create the institutional infrastructure for justice? How do we institutionalize justice so that justice, the more we can objectify justice, the more successful we are in the pursuit of justice? Because as long as justice remains a matter of personal perspective, it is not a resolution at all. The more you are able to convince the parties that justice is more than simply a matter of personal subjective perception through institutional means, the more you are successful in the enterprise of justice itself. Another thing to point out about this ayah is that this ayah played a pivotal role in the now lost ethic of dealing with rebellion in Islamic law. I'll sum it up in this. Imam Ali was confronted with the rebellion of the Khawarij, and among others, of course. But anyway, stick with the Khawarij. So the Khawarij refused to obey Imam Ali and rebel against him, and he is asked, are they kuffar? And he says, no, they're not kuffar. They in fact, they worship more than we do. And they asked, are they, I forgot now, I think fusaq or something like that. And he says, again, more or less the same answer, no, they're not. And he says, they are our brothers who have transgressed against us. And then he says a statement that becomes very important in the creation of the jurisprudence of rebellion in Islamic law. He says, you لكم علينا ثلاث. You have 3 rights over us. لا نمنعكم مساجد الله. We can't bar you from worshipping in Allah's mosques. ولا نمنعكم الفيء ما دامت أيديكم معنا. And if you join us in battles, in other words, if you are part of our army in confronting our external enemy, we cannot deny you your share of payments. So in other words, we treat you like we treat everyone else. ولا نبدأكم بقتال ما لم تبدأونا. And we don't attack you first. The reason I underscore this today is this tradition of Imam Ali that basically says the state doesn't spill the blood of dissenters unless they begin with violence. And then you use violence only to repel their aggression. And it goes beyond that. You can't kill the prisoners, you can't kill the wounded, you can't enslave them, a whole set of rules. There's another tradition attributed to the Prophet, a false tradition, that calls the Khawarij the dogs of hellfire and the true kafirs of the Ummah. And in Islamic tradition, which could not, Imam Ali was more knowledgeable about the Sunnah of the Prophet than anyone else. And there is no way he would have said about the Khawarij that you are our brothers, but you have the right to worship in our mosque, and you, etc., etc. if in fact the Prophet had said that they were no longer Muslims. And anyway, there were no Khawarij at the time the Prophet was alive. But according to this tradition, the Prophet sort of predicts that after I die, there will come people who are the dogs of hellfire and so on. Today, remarkably, the tradition that calls the Khawarij the dogs of hellfire, and that calls them kafirs, and that says that basically you can kill them, has been used by this Egyptian government against the Muslim Brotherhood, has been used by Haftar and the clergy of Haftar against the government in Trablus. The horrendous human rights abuses have been justified on the basis of that tradition, has been used by the pro-Emirati Yemeni forces against everyone. So constantly in modern Islam, whenever you want to kill your political opponent, you call them Khawarij Kilab Nar. That they're the dogs of hellfire, and they're the Khawarij, and then you start pontificating, and you hear the same thing from Saudi, that in Islam the Khawarij should just be killed, and then they call anyone that disagrees with the Saudi government Khawarij, anyone that disagrees with the Egyptian government Khawarij, anyone that disagrees with the authority of Haftar in Libya Khawarij, anyone that disagrees with the pro-Emirati government Khawarij. And within all of that, of course, no mention is ever made of the far more Islamically anchored tradition of Al-Imam Ali, and the way he clearly said, Khawarij or no Khawarij, you can't just simply spill their blood. I never thought when I wrote the Rebellion book that I would witness a day where so many Muslims have lost their lives on the basis of a clearly invented tradition about how dissenters, people who dissent from whatever government there is, are simply Khawarij, and you can just simply kill them in a summary fashion because they have no rights and they're just dogs of hellfire. I never thought, but when things are messed up, they're really messed up. But I can't possibly portray to you how many Muslims have lost their lives. Even someone like Ali Jum'ah, the former Mufti of Egypt, when he was telling the Egyptian military that they can massacre people in Rab'a at will, and they don't have to worry about it, he again resorted to that tradition, which I know he knows is a fabrication. But all of that is part of the intellectual culture of this ayah. But notice that even in this ayah, it never, again, remarkably, when those people that go around and say, well, we can go and massacre people in Rab'a because Salman al-Oda can be executed because he is a dissenter against the government, or there's or all the people who've been executed in Libya and Yemen because they rebelled against the government. Look at the ayah. Look at the language of verse 9. If two parties disagree, the moral obligation, the ethical obligation, is to establish justice between them. It doesn't talk about murdering either of the parties. And only if a party you are allowed to fight them in order to bring them to a just resolution, not in order to bring them to your will, not in order to dominate them, not in order to vanquish them. A critical social ethic, and a social ethic, if Muslims would have learned, so much social trauma and political trauma and bloodshed would have been avoided in their history. Okay. Then, and this is underscored, إنما المؤمنون إخوة فاصلحوا بين أخويكم. The overriding principle is that believers are brothers and sisters. إخوة can go for masculine or feminine. And the obligation is إصلاح بين الإخوة, is the obligation is to reconcile and to bring brethren together. The attitude is markedly egalitarian. And mind you, and this is the thing that blows your mind, it is egalitarian after it had just said that the Prophet is present amongst you. It could have said, well, the Prophet is with you, and anyone that dares disagree with the Prophet is a miserable, horrible human being that should be killed and vanquished and made to disappear off the face of the earth. But it doesn't. And it emphasizes that even with the Prophet present, what the decisive yardstick is the yardstick of justice and equity. And the principle that whatever is done, whatever is said, you are brothers and sisters. Final point about this before I move on. And notice that it underscores the principle of fraternity amongst Muslims at a time that Islam is expanding. So it's like, yeah, I know Islam is expanding. I know you have a lot of social problems. I know you have a lot of challenges. But you can't lose sight that when you are brothers and sisters, that is the bond of Islam. Okay. Then it moves on with, again, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, like a code of social ethics. لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منه ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهم ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. This is 11. There are many reports about this ayah and what could have possibly been an occasion for revelation, or the familiar theme now, that Okay, so some reports say that some of the wives of the Prophet used to make fun of Salama, who's also a wife of the Prophet, because she was very short. Um, Other reports say that Safiya, who is one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, um, complained to the Prophet that his wives sometimes put her down by calling her, um, by saying, "You daughter of a Jew." And the Prophet's response, his reported response, is actually quite, because she said, "They tell me you are a daughter of a Jew," and they mean it in a derogatory manner. And the Prophet says, "Well, you should answer them and tell them, I am the daughter of Harun, and my uncle is Musa, and my husband is Muhammad." Harun, of course, the Prophet Harun and the Prophet Musa, alayhi salam, and my husband. So, in other words, it's it, his response is, you. In fact, you have nothing to be ashamed of. If anything, you have many honors being a Jew, or depending on whether it's a religion or a race or whatever. There are reports that that Aisha used to make fun of Zainab bint Khuzaymah. And again, Aisha, wife of the Prophet, and Zainab bint Khuzaymah, another wife of the Prophet. There are reports that, this report actually doesn't involve the wives of the Prophet, that Thabit ibn Qais, this is the fellow who was hard of hearing. So he would because he was hard of hearing, he would always come and he would want to sit as close to the Prophet as possible so he can hear. So when he would come, he would always tell people, okay, can I have a space close to the Prophet so I can hear? So he sees he asks someone to make space for him, to move or to make space so he can sit next to the Prophet so he can hear. And the person he asks was I don't remember his name, but he was a new convert to Islam anyway, or a recent convert. And the man was sort of gruff, and he looks at Thabit ibn Qais, and he doesn't respond, he doesn't answer him first. And then Thabit ibn Qais sort of asks him again, and then he finally tells him, "Go away, Ya Asam." Asam is like, when you call someone deaf or mute, it's sort of a derogatory way of referring to someone who can't hear. And Thabit ibn Qais is hurt, and he, hurts him, and he withdraws, and so on. And so all of these reports are contenders or reported as contenders for occasions of revelation. The insults against, or the making fun of Safiya, the making fun of Zainab bint Khuzaymah, the making fun of Salama, the making fun or the insult of Thabit ibn Qusay, and what they point out to is something that we know about society at the time, is that it was not at all uncommon in society at the time, and even for centuries later, even to mock people by their physical defects. Whether how tall, whether they're blind, whether they're deaf, whether they're mute, whatever physical feature that you could pick on, that was not at all uncommon. And that the Quran comes and underscores what already the Prophet has been preaching or teaching, that mocking people, pointing out to their defects as a way of putting them down, is against Islamic ethics. And what's very interesting is عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم. See, a lot of modern Muslims misunderstand this because they of old Arabic. عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم, it doesn't say don't mock because maybe the person you're mocking is better than you. That's the way that it's normally understood in the modern. What it's saying is, don't mock lest the person that you mock becomes better than you. Now, why is the difference so significant? Because of the ethic that comes along with it. The Prophet ﷺ, commenting on this, said, لا تظهر الشماتة لا تظهر الشماتة لأخيك فيعافيه الله ويبتليك. That if you mock your brother or your sister, whatever feature you are mocking, Allah could afflict you with it. So, عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم means, lest Allah takes it, the thing that you are putting down, He makes it a part of you. So, Ibn Mas'ud, for instance, commented on this. He said, لو سخرت من كلب لخشيت أن يسخطني الله كلبا. That I don't even mock a dog because I fear that God, if I do, God will turn me into a dog. That's sort of the and as to the I forgot one other contender for occasion for revelation, is that, remember that delegation from Bani Tamim that I told you about? Well, Banu Tamim, as I told you, they were gruff Arabs, and they were rather known for their gruffness. So not only did they come and invite the Prophet to a duel of poetry, where they brag about their lineage, not only did they call upon the Prophet to come out and talk to them immediately, but apparently also, when Banu Tamim arrived, they noticed the group of people living in the vicinity in the mosque in Medina, people like Bilal and Suhaib, Khabbab, and so on. People who were very poor. And Banu Tamim started mocking these group of people. And according to this tradition, the Quran comes and says, No, you want to be Muslims. You can't do that. You can't. Islam doesn't. If you're going to be Muslims, you can't mock the poor. Again, all of them. I mean, uh, any of them, do I really believe that any of them was the occasion for revelation? No. All of them are probably events. But the Muslim mind realized that this revelation applies to all of them. And so they can be taken as demonstrative examples of what the ayat apply to. Um, this the 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 Prophet ﷺ has a number of traditions where he underscores that, of course, if you mock someone for being short, it's not that Allah, you wake up one day and find yourself short. But other than the sin in the hereafter, Allah is likely to afflict you in due time with the type of ailment or affliction or problem that gives you the same sense of inferiority that you inflicted upon others. And this was a firmly established Islamic ethic. So I even remember, like, my grandmother would always, don't make fun of, like, when kids play, don't make fun of anyone because, Allah will turn and make you suffer what you make. Of course, it's amazing that it still existed by the time my grandmother was around, but I haven't encountered it in anyone in the last 30 years. So I don't know. I mean, that must the flood of westernization and so-called modernization might have completely made it vanish from our psyche. Okay. ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابذوا بالألقاب بئس اسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. This is 11. And don't call each other names. The important thing I want to underscore here, again, as part of the Islamic ethics that developed from these Quranic prescriptions, is you would find in so many Muslim writings, and it was a part of our sort of moral consciousness, is that it was reported as a lesson attributed to a number of companions. It was reported as a statement of a sage without a specific companion, but it was discussed in so many of these books on social ethics and Islamic interpretive tradition that the المؤمنون كنفس واحدة, believers are supposed to be as if a single person. فمن عاب مؤمنا كأنما عاب نفسه. So if you insult or demean or mock a believer, it is as if you've insulted and demeaned yourself. The aspiration is that that you would, the level of intimacy you would feel towards one another is to that extent that when you think of an insult, say, I'm insulting, fundamentally, someone who's part of me. Of course, I don't need to tell you what happened to that ethic. But the other part that is worth understanding is that this is a tradition often that goes back to Huzaifa, that a man who's, again, if we do the seerah, we'll be able to talk about Huzaifa. Anyway, so Huzaifa goes and complains to the Prophet ﷺ, and he says to him, I have an unclean tongue, meaning I utter obscenities a lot. I cuss out people. I curse a lot. And how do I solve this problem? And the Prophet ﷺ gives him a prescription that was a part ingrained in the fabric of Muslim culture for many centuries. And he told him, Huzaifa, how often do you say astaghfirullah? And I don't remember how many times he tells him. He says, every time you utter an obscenity, for every obscenity 100 times astaghfirullah. And every time you think of an obscenity, instead of uttering it, say astaghfirullah. So it is remarkable that for centuries, this was like, as you know, as common as people would grow up knowing about. I don't know, what do people know about these days? Popeye, the Sailor Man. You know,
It's a bit old.
it's old. Oh, okay. But so you say you know, for every cuss you say 100 times astaghfirullah, and the idea that it's not a matter of affectations, and we'll get to that in a second. It's not a matter of displays. It's not a matter of, you know, impressing anyone, but it is between you and your sense of, again, what would the Prophet ﷺ expect from you if you were in the Prophet's company. Okay, so mocking, obscenities, and this is described as ismul fusuq, that mocking and obscenities is a form of fisq, ba'd al-iman. And that if you don't repent, أولئك هم الظالمون, these are truly the unjust. And then, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم. Oh my God. Okay. It's 9:40. Should I stop and continue on Tuesday? Because I don't know if I can. I mean, I can finish by 10, but I would be rushing it.
No. For Tuesday. Don't rush it.
Most of the people online ran away anyway, so. My respects to those of you who haven't run away. Okay. Huh?
Jenna's requesting you do the ayah.
Just this one, because, never mind. No, it's not my job. I can't tell you what to do. I'm sorry. I take it back. Just because
I want to hear it too.
Okay, we'll do one more ayah and then we'll stop. By popular demand.
I've been waiting for that one.
Yeah, it's like-
Specifically.
It's a banger.
Okay, so now 12. So immediately you're struck by the three, to avoid speculation, which remind us of the not too far away prescription of the duty to verify. But as a general matter, اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم. Not the recognition that sometimes you have to make decisions based on incomplete information. So not all dhan is anything less than certainty. So it is the type of information or type of data that makes you not absolutely sure, but the preponderance of belief is such and such. It's I think it is the case that X, Y, and Z. And Allah comes and says, warns you that there is always this risk, is that when you say, I think, I believe, and if you think and you believe and you keep it to yourself, there's no sin. But if you think and you believe and you communicate it or you act upon it, there's a risk. And the risk is that you are committing a sin. If you are acting unjustly, if in fact what you think is without foundation and what you believe is incorrect, and if the decision is indeed wrongful. So Allah says, keep in mind, there's that risk. بعض الظن إثم. But this is compounded with other norms that bond with it like a molecular structure. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا. Don't spy. And tajassus here, normally when we talk in the West, in English about spying is violating the intimacy of someone to extract, to find out information. So you pierce the veil of privacy. But tajassus is a broader concept in Arabic and in Islamic law and in Islamic ethics. It is not just piercing the expectation of privacy. It is not just going into the Hujurat. But tajassus includes the deliberate effort to find out information about individuals for unjust causes, and for most Islamic ethicists, or for no cause. So the gathering of information simply to satisfy your curiosity, or the gathering of information to further harm, and furthering harm could also mean damaging the reputation of, when you have no grounds to damage the reputation of someone. So if I'm gathering information to know if I should go to a certain doctor for treatment, and I want to know if this doctor is good, that's not what tajassus is. Tajassus is when you are, I want to know if I should hire a lawyer. So I go and I'm getting information about the performance of this lawyer. Tajassus is when you are seeking to find information. You either to pursue unjust causes, like damaging the reputation of a person, or, in the opinion of most, or for the purposes of engaging in entertainment ghaiba. So you are chatting about someone just as a form of entertainment. So I guess tajassus would include what we today would call stalking, whether I mean physical stalking or cyber stalking or whatever. But it's remarkable that in the Quranic ethic, the social ethics that the Quran leaves us with, and sort of like a legacy it entrusts us with, is don't spy, don't turn into yourselves into sort of lookout eyes where a human being feels that the eyes of others upon them, keeping track of their faults. I mean, when you get to the bottom line is that that is not conducive to the Quranic idea of brotherhood and sisterhood amongst you. And it's not conducive to the idea that your honor is part of my honor and your reputation is part of my reputation. That if in fact the idea is that we are always looking at, well, what are your shortcomings? What are my shortcomings? In order to constantly keep an air of competition and an air of who is better than who, it doesn't take a genius to realize, well, what does that do to the fabric of society? وَلَا يَخْتَبْ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا. Now, ghiba, of course, is what we backbiting is, and there's a famous hadith that, I mean, it raises a lot of complicated issues but it's often cited that if you talk about someone and that whether you say what is in fact the truth about them, but they don't, if you talk about someone negatively but what you say about them is the truth, so that's ghaiba. And if you talk about them negatively and what you're saying about them is not true, it's even worse than ghaiba. That hadith, I mean, it should be understood with qualifications. That so much depends on the purpose of the speech. So, again, if I'm talking about a doctor, and the reason I'm talking about this doctor is to make an assessment whether I should seek treatment with the doctor, that's not what the hadith is talking about. Or if I'm talking about a political candidate, and the reason I'm talking about the political candidate is to decide whether to vote for them or not vote for them, that's not what the hadith is talking about. The clearest example of classic type situation is when you are talking about someone in a way that they would deem hurtful, whether true or untrue, simply because of your loss of moral control upon yourself. So, go back to the beginning of Surah Al-Hujurat, because Surah Al-Hujurat is like a tight glove. all fitting within. We all have vanities. In the same way that you might lack self-control of proper reverence with the Prophet, you might lack self-control when you talk about the other. So if you are motivated by jealousy, then that's the improper ghaibah. If you are motivated by boredom, that's ghaibah. If you are motivated by a sense of anger, but that has no constructive purpose, you're just angry. If you are motivated by a sense of spite, but again, it has no constructive purpose. It's not that you're making a decision whether to hire someone, whether to vote for someone, whether to study with someone. You are simply vetting. Now, how does it all fit together? The worst ghaibah is that which is based on dhann. It's like gradations, so it all feeds within each other. If what is involved is dhann, speculative thinking, hearsay, information that you are actually not certain about, plus information obtained through the ethic of tajassus, plus these two things led to the act of actually backbiting someone. So all these three are involved. Most scholars say that's a kabira. Then that becomes a major sin. A kabira min al-kabair. So that's like high on the scale. Then you go into a continuum. Low on the scale is a ghaibah in which did not involve tajassus, involved something that I perhaps witnessed directly, not hearsay, but I might have witnessed directly and misunderstood or understood, and then I spoke of it, and then I regained self-control, so I censored myself. So that's usually given as an example as the sort of the other extreme on the continuum. That, okay, I made I spoke about, and it's like, okay, but Allahu A'lam, astaghfirullah, I don't want to indulge in speculation. So it's a contained incident of where self-control is involved. Now, between that and the other extreme, where you deliberately engage in, well, let me find out. In our day and age, I guess, I don't know much about social media, but I guess, you could go do spying on social media. And, let me get together information here and there, and then let me come up with some speculative ideas about what I think was going on, and then let me talk about this person. Then you could actually be committing a kabira, a major sin. And the more you indulge, and this is, Ghazali in his Ihya writes wonderfully about this, the more you indulge in dhann, in speculation, so if you imagine on a continuum, and the more speculative your data and your thinking, and the more tajassusi your data and your thinking, the more you engaged in spying and stalking and stuff like that, and the more purposeless your ghaibah, the more you don't have a legitimate objective, the greater the sin. Of course, Ghazali then, talks about how the Prophet, والسلام, in his Isra, goes and he sees people in hell and they're suffering this and that and this way and that way. And then he asks, why are these people suffering this way? And say, these are the people who committed the kabira of ghaiba. And then Ghazali says, well, this is an example of how these people are suffering in hell because they've committed a ghaiba that involved zan and tajassus and no self-control. And I'm very skeptical about all the ahadith that describe punishment and hellfire during the Isra. But the point remains, is that there's a huge difference. The whole theme of Surah Al-Hujurat is that idea of self-control and the bond between Muslims and Muslims looking out for one another. And when ghaiba involves the act of divorcing a fellow Muslim as an other, it's the same thing with mocking. It's the same thing with deriding others, putting down others. When that Muslim becomes the other, and I have no empathy for this Muslim, and I no longer connect with this Muslim as the other, and then that becomes the license to go down a path of dhann and tajassus, the worse the sin of ghaiba. And notice what Muslim scholars wrote a great deal about. That Allah compares this to eating the flesh, the dead flesh of your brother or your sister, which, as has been pointed out by so many, if Allah wanted to give us an image of how vile the sin is, I don't think Allah could have chosen a stronger example. Because, in fact, Ghazali says something very interesting, that it says it is because Muslims are supposed to be as if one body. What Allah is actually saying is that it is as if you are actually consuming your own flesh. And can you imagine the horror of eating your own flesh? So, this is the flesh of one body. And you are, the maita here, the killing here, is the killing of the idea of a Muslim ummah, because ghaiba involves the othering of a Muslim. And the othering of a Muslim is the beginning of the dynamic for the unraveling of the idea of a single ummah, bonded together. And it is precisely the type of mechanism that leads to the loss of empathy. The Prophet ﷺ, when he's asked about this verse in particular, there are a lot of hadiths, but there are two of them that I think stand out as really worthy of reflection and learning. So, the first one, the Prophet ﷺ responds by saying, خَصْلَتَانِ لَيْسَ فَوْقَهُمَا شَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَيْرِ. There are two characteristics that they're two qualities, there are no better qualities, that like they're the epitome of goodness. الظن بالله وحسن الظن بعباد الله. sorry, حسن الظن بالله وحسن الظن بعباد الله, that you think well of Allah. So you believe that Allah wants the best for you, and that Allah is in fact the most compassionate, the most merciful, who wants the best for you and knows what is best for you. And حسن الظن بعباد الله, and thinking well, so treating other human beings with the same goodwill. It does, of course, it doesn't mean that you're al-mu'min kaysun fatin. It doesn't mean that you're dumb or that you're naive or whatever, but that you don't think ill, you don't deny people, especially the way you talk about them and the way you think about reputations. You don't jump to the worst interpretation. وخصلتان ليس فوقهما شيء من الشر, and there are two characteristics that are absolutely the worst, and nothing is worse than them. سوء الظن بالله, to think ill of Allah, وسوء الظن بعباد الله, to similarly think ill of other human beings. I mean, you could have, if you wanted a real Islamic education in our schools and so on, you could have many class discussions about this one hadith. Because you could have, especially young Muslim minds, ponder and think and reflect upon what does thinking well of Allah and thinking ill of Allah entail, and what does thinking well of people and thinking ill of people entail, and the various permutations of that. The other hadith, again, the Prophet ﷺ is asked about this ayah, and he says, إياكم والظن فإن الظن أكذب الحديث ولا تجسسوا ولا تحسسوا ولا تنافسوا ولا تحاسدوا ولا تباغضوا وكونوا عباد الله إخوانا. This hadith you could spend hours on. So the Prophet ﷺ says, and it's been reported, I mean, this one reaches the level of mutawatir without any question, that don't rely on dhann, on speculation, because often speculation means that you build your life and your decisions on falsehood, on lies. The duty to verify truth, the duty to satisfy your conscience that you're not just, if it matters, then you should invest the energy and time to actually know what's true or not true, if it matters. And entertaining yourself or just satisfying your curiosity doesn't mean it matters. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا, and do not spy. وَلَا تَحَاسَدُوا, and do not envy one another. وَلَا تَنَافَسُوا. التنافس here, normally people translate it as competition, but in this context, what it means is not, it's the type of competition where you hurt the other in order to prevent them from getting to head. So you actually pull someone behind because you don't want them to be better. وَلَا تَحَسَّسُوا. التحسس is a form of spying, but while tajassus it's like being a voyeur. You're looking where you should not look. At tahassus, you sort of like go around feeling where you're not supposed to feel things. So both are a form of spying, both are a form of violation of privacy, but one has to do with your eyes, the other has to do with your other senses. وَلَا تَبَاغَضُوا. And and Muslims don't pause enough with tabaghud. Tabaghud is not when you go out of your way to hate one another or to spite one another. But a tabaghud is when you don't work very hard to prevent yourself from spiting one another or hating one another. There's another tradition about the tabaghud that if you feel a dislike towards another person and you accept dislike without an effort to overcome the dislike, that's tabaghud. That you must exert an effort to restrain and control. وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ إِخْوَانًا. And be brethren and come together as brothers and sisters. There is hadith, another hadith from the Prophet. Again, it's widely reported. Probably, definitely, I think actually it reaches the level of Tawatur. Where the Prophet ﷺ said, إنك إن اتبعت عورات المسلمين أو أفسدتهم أو كدت تفسدهم. That if Muslims build a society in which they spy on one another, that the ethics of the society will become corrupted. It's extremely well ahead of its time. It's like if people are in society and they cannot rely on the expectation of privacy, that has a very corrupting influence on society. In the Sufi tafsir especially the Sufi tafsir, not exclusively, but they often talk about the obligation of ittiham al-nafs. And the way it's explained is this. Is say the primary obligation is to vet oneself. عليك بنفسك. So your obligation is to cleanse yourself. وما دام عليك نفسك. And as long as your obligation is to vet yourself, that's the primary obligation. عليك باتهام نفسك في كل ما يقع لك من نقصان غيرك. So whenever you are confronted by the shortcoming of another, since your primary obligation is not to vet the other but to vet yourself, then your primary duty, your initial duty, is upon noticing the shortcoming of another, is to take your perception and turn the gaze inwards. And then to ask the question, do I suffer the fault that I accuse the other of? And especially in Sufi literature, they write a great deal that if you have a good teacher, because they always emphasize the role of the teacher will demonstrate to you or will show you that if you properly do that, you will have no space or energy to actually notice, to actually find faults in others, because you will always find the fault that you notice in others is actually within you. And Sufis write a great deal about why is it that we notice the faults that actually threaten others, that actually threaten us the most. And they threaten us because, and this is again according to Sufi literature, that in our subconscious we know it is us that we see in others. I'm if I spend time on that, then that it will be, and I want to stay with sort of my take on the surah, because this literature is so teasingly beautiful. And it's just such a nuanced part of the Islamic tradition. People who had spent an enormous amount of effort on, and Surah Al-Mujadala, Surah Al-Hujurat plays a very prominent role in the self-cleansing of any disciple of Sufism. So, in all the tariqas that I am aware of, among the first things you learn is that if you don't have Surah Al-Hujurat memorized, they have you memorize Surah Al-Hujurat, and you recite Surah Al-Hujurat so many times, because the process of this self-cleansing, and a self-cleansing is impossible with hasad and tabaghud, with envy and rancor and speaking ill of others and noticing the faults of others. It is just it's a no-go if you're on a real Sufi path. But going back, to that, the emphasis that I'm putting on it is that, again, the idea of self-control, that Surah Al-Hujurat begins with, because inshallah, as we will see, this is critical. As we will finish inshallah Surah Al-Hujurat and then put the entire message of Surah Al-Hujurat together, and you will see that it is really critical to the entire moral lesson that Surah Al-Hujurat delivers to the Muslim Ummah. It's a small surah, but it's a huge surah at the same time. As short as it is, as enormously impactful as it was, and hopefully continues to be. What time is it? Oh, wow, okay. So let's definitely stop and continue on Tuesday, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. this was incredible. I think I took like 13 pages of notes and another like, I don't know, 5 pages here to try and capture highlights. But because it is really, there's so much, we covered so much in this session. Oh gosh, where do we start? So it's always so powerful. Thank you so much. This is such a beautiful surah. And I think that it's always so powerful when you cover the context and what was happening then, because it really places, us in the mindset of what was happening with people and how they understood. And the idea of late converts coming in, sacrifice. Like, I think that through all of the stories that we've learned, it is sort of strange to think like, okay, now you've got people that are joining you really late and they missed all of this part, all of that sacrifice and all of that really pushed people to build their character. But the Sirah stories are incredible and again highlight, I think, the importance of, inshallah, trying to move to the Sirah after this project. But the telling us about the educational delegations and the sacrifice that people made to go and teach other people about being, about Islam and the Islamic ethic, and helping us really recall just how much the Prophet, peace be upon him, how much he went through in terms of navigating all of these tests and the loss of all of the children and the loved ones and the constant, just drama and trauma, I'm sure, and how he was able to get through it through worship and dhikr. And I think that lesson alone in going through the Sirah would be just tremendous for people to really grow. The idea of this phrase, "O you believers," as being an intimate call from Allah is so beautiful. And the idea of just teaching as a habit respect and reverence, and having that understanding that that's a self-censoring mechanism, and recognizing how Wahhabism has really been anti-reverence for the Prophet Muhammad. And of course we see and feel the impact of that in our modern day. And the question of how can you be actually mindful of what the Prophet would approve of or not if you actually don't know the Prophet and you don't know who that person, was, or what the Prophet cared about, loved, reacted to, and asking the question, is the spirit of the Prophet Muhammad with you? And if you, and train yourself to think, what would the Prophet, and you wrote about this in The Search for Beauty, it's like, what would the Prophet do in this situation? What would the Prophet want from me, and would the Prophet approve of these decisions? And just the really important point about Islamophobia and people like, Ayan Hirsi Ali, and really zeroing in on attacking the Prophet and killing the Prophet, as a moral figure and an ethical figure, and what that actually means for the future of Islam. And again, underscores the importance of, inshallah, us getting to the Sirah and learning these stories. But the central idea of being mindful, and having the example that we begin with the tone of voice, and that how this created this whole ethic towards your teacher, your parents, your elders, and how this is the quintessential example of self-control, controlling your impulses as a habit, learning that as a habit, and understanding that we are coded to have a sense of reverence, and that we have to be reflective about who do you revere. Do you revere your teachers, your parents, and your elders? If you don't, then you run the risk of revering people who are in possession of power, celebrities, things that are on other, less obviously ethical and moral terms. And the beautiful verse about how Allah molded your piety through these tests to control your impulse, and that this is how you achieve true piety and strength, which again, ties back to this idea of people joining and not having those tests and those sacrifices, and just, and also appreciating how much people who've been in this message for so long really were strong from everything they'd been through. Again, just emphasizing the internal indicators of self-control, tone of voice, being mindful, showing proper deference, and this whole idea of self-control is critical to the idea of controlling yourself from backbiting, from spying, just busying yourself with yourself and not with others, and then being introduced to all the different social ethics. If you receive information, you have a duty to investigate before acting on it, being a weighty person, taking seriously, being morally conscious about the flow of information, processing information, due diligence, don't be a lightweight, and understanding your historical moment, that the Prophet Muhammad is with you now, and knowing now that that was not going to continue for very much longer, and to try and just like internalize that mindfulness, so that Allah would infuse your heart with this attraction, this gift of an attraction towards faith, and a repulsion towards the opposite. And emphasizing the idea of brotherhood and sisterhood, focusing on peace, fraternity, justice, and fairness, and creating the enterprise for justice. So creating mechanisms for justice, institutions for justice, and ways to objectify justice so that it goes beyond just a subjective understanding or a subjective perception. Underscoring that you cannot spill the blood of dissenters, teaching us about this invented tradition about the Khawarij, the dogs of hellfire, and how so many Muslims have been killed in our modern day based on that invention. And the social ethic of, principle of fraternity, peace, getting to justice, getting to peace through just solutions, that you can't mock people or put people down because of their defects, and that certainly Allah could have you suffer from a similar thing that you are mocking others of, not to call each other names, and not to use obscenities, avoiding speculation, don't pierce the veil of intimacy for unjust purposes or just for entertainment, and that this could actually, lead to a major sin. The combination of, on the one hand, you could have it just be lack of self-control. On the other hand, it could be deliberately engaging in spying, trying to find things out for immoral reasons. And just this concept of the Muslims being like one body, and this visualization of, if you don't think of others as part of yourself and you otherize other people, that you are actually eating the flesh of your own body, or otherizing Muslims in a way that you're killing the notion of a single ummah. Alhamdulillah, that is incredible, and we're not even done, and I cannot wait for, even to like touch upon these Sufi, interpretations, and just the idea of, again, underscoring the importance of turning inward. It, like, in every way, it's like every opportunity to turn inward and focus on yourself, because there's so much that you need to fix before you start looking at others. Anyway, thank you so much. It's priceless information. It just gives us a window into how much more there is to learn, and inshallah, I pray that we can move forward with the Surah after this. We're just going to keep hammering that home, because it just becomes so clear how important that knowledge is, as a continuation of everything we're learning here. So, alhamdulillah, thank you so much, and inshallah, we look forward to an amazing session. Have a great rest of the weekend. Looking forward to meeting again. Oh my God, are we going to meet on Tuesday? Because we'll have to see, right?
I think to continue Surah Al-Hujurat, yes.
Okay.
Because it's
maybe
not...
the first week of classes is not as difficult as once you jump in.
Yeah, because I don't have to prepare anything.
Okay, inshallah. Okay, our last
So I don't
Tuesday
have to
session for a
prepare.
while, inshallah. So we will see you Tuesday. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Yes,
Assalamu
inshallah.
alaikum.
Salam alaikum.